um, everybody has their own path, and the paths are never smooth. Usually our paths are a little bit uncomfortable, a little bit painful, and then we look back and we say, oh, how good is it for someone to begin with, The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus. How nice would it be for someone to begin with that book? But the philosophical texts are usually kind of related to each other. It's like, a spider web. Think about a spider web. Any book in philosophy, every important book in philosophy is like one node in that net. It's a one intersection in the spider web. And because it belongs to that web, it is making reference to other points. It's making reference to other philosophers, other questions, other texts. Sometimes these references are direct and clear. Sometimes they are not even direct and obvious. Sometimes it's in the background. Like, for example, Aristotle is not mentioned, but the most influential thinker in this writer's life and work is Aristotle. But the influence is so deep that it's just in the air. It's not mentioned directly. With that in mind, these are my 3 suggestions. First, this is related to my other response when I said I prefer now to think about question not what is philosophy, but what is a philosophical life. Having that in mind, I would recommend reading the biography of Ludwig Wittgenstein. It is called Wittgenstein, The Duty of Genius. It's a big book, but it's extremely enjoyable and inspiring. It's a book that you can read, and maybe it will help you realize whether you love this path, this form of life, this way of thinking. Because Wittgenstein had a more or less, I don't know what other word to use to describe it, but he was obsessed with language. He was obsessed with thinking. He was obsessed with what it is that we do when we use language, and what it is, and how that is different from what we think we are doing. And he also identified some of the misunderstandings, very important misunderstandings of philosophers. So he's a great person to study, especially at the beginning, because you begin not only with an introduction to philosophy, but also with a critique of philosophy. Like, these philosophers are occasionally, they can be foolish. They can overestimate how much they can be done with their work. And he was at the same time a philosopher. He was a philosopher who wanted to deflate, like deflating a balloon, who wanted to let the air come out. And one of his famous sentiments is that philosophical puzzles usually arise from our misunderstandings of language. So what is true? What is the truth? What is the ultimate truth? I mean, that is a way of using the word true and truth, but it is a very unusual way. Usually I say, this book cover has blue on it. The color blue is here. Is that true or false? So when you point to something identifiable, concrete, and say, is that true or false? That makes sense. That's an everyday way of referring to truth and falsehood. But to say, what is the truth? That's a bit weird. Could be according to Wittgenstein, a lot of these cases are misuse and misunderstanding of concepts in language. I forgot the author's name. It's Ray Monk. After that, if you're interested to read more, continue, there's a book by Peter Strawson, a British philosopher. Very short book. I think it is still available. I hope it is not out of print. But it is short introduction to philosophy. It's called Analysis and Synthesis. No, it's not. It's not called that. It's called Analysis and Metaphysics. Let me check. Yes, it is called Analysis and Metaphysics by Peter F. Strawson. And the subtitle for the book is An Introduction to Philosophy. It's really good to read this book after reading about Wittgenstein, because Wittgenstein is kind of like reading about him and reading him brings in a very destructive and pessimistic force about philosophy. And to know that Strawson is a person who came after Wittgenstein and reading and now writing a book called An Introduction to Philosophy, Analysis and Metaphysics, and talking about the tasks, what we can accomplish. It's a very it's a very enjoyable thing to read after Wittgenstein's biography. Okay, one more book. I'll choose a book by Alva Noe, and that is one of his recent books, Strange Tools, Art and Human Nature. Alva Noe is very accessible. Again, just like, even though he belongs in that spider web, but it's part of the spider web that you can examine in isolation, in relative isolation, because it contains a cartoon image of the rest of the spider web inside that segment. So you can reflect and be a little bit clear about at least some ideas about the nature of art and the nature of philosophy. It's very readable, very enjoyable. I really like Alva Noe. I was once a member of a book club, a reading group, and most members of that reading group were philosophers. And they were very critical of Alva Noe. And I've spoken with people in psychology who are also very critical and skeptical of Alva Noe. And I've heard their reasons, but I still am quite fond of Noe. I like him, especially because he's so accessible and easy to read. So, to repeat, Ray Monk's biography of Wittgenstein, Duty of Genius, Analysis and Metaphysics, An Introduction to Philosophy by Peter F. Strawson, and Alva Noe's book, very nice book, Strange Tools.